My guest for this week is Victor Santos. Victor is a world language education and assessment expert, a linguist, and an award-winning author. Anchoring this conversation this week is his latest book, What Makes Us Human? And the answer is language. Take a look, please, on my website, fluency.consulting, for information about Victor and to find out about this book and how to order it. It's a mark of Victor's compassion and focus on the power of language that he will encourage you both through my website and his own, www.authorvictorsantos.com, to ask your public library to order the book so that it may be shared widely to make a change for the world on the importance of language. Enjoy this conversation with my guest, Victor Santos.
Welcome to Season 5, Episode 1 of It's About Language, hosted by Norah Lulich Jones. This podcast explores the profound impact of language on our lives. In today's episode, Norah welcomes Victor Santos, author of What Makes Us Human. Victor's innovative approach uses thoughtful riddles and evocative illustrations to delve into the essence of language and its crucial role in our lives. Victor's work highlights that language is key to connection and mutual respect in a world facing challenges like fear and loneliness. Join Norah as she explores how language shapes our perceptions and discovers the healing power of words. Welcome to the podcast.
When I start my podcast, I usually don't do a little mini bio of my guest because I invite you to go indeed to my website, fluency.consulting, and take a look at all the resources. And in the case of Victor Santos, there are so many resources, so many opportunities for you, and so much information. But I've got to start by saying that you're about to listen to this conversation with Victor Santos, who is a Brazilian-American Ph.D. linguist, award-winning children's book author, and, as important as everything else, the father to two multicultural and multilingual children who have lived in 6 different countries and studied 10 languages. Victor Santos, it's a joy to have you here. I look forward to our conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me, Norah. It's great to see you again. Our paths have crossed in the past, and I'm sure it's crossing again now.
It certainly is. The world has a wonderful way about that, and it's certainly to my delight. In front of me, just to jump right into where I have been attracted to what it is that you're doing recently, I have your award-winning book that has been chosen by UNESCO, and I'm going to let you describe what UNESCO has been doing with this book. It's called What Makes Us Human, and as one could expect in a podcast called It's About Language, that would be language. Victor, tell us about this book. Tell us about the experience of what's happening with this book, where it has come from, however you wish to start, and thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the opportunity. So What Makes Us Human is a children's picture book. That basically means it's an illustrated children's book that was published now in March of 2024 from an American publisher called Erdman's Books for Young Readers, and it was published in partnership with UNESCO. The book has been chosen as the official children's book for the United Nations International Decade of Indigenous Languages. So just to backtrack a little bit, in 2019, I started writing children's books, and it was actually connected to language because my very first book, I wanted to show my son, who was only 3 years old at the time, that he should be proud of having different languages spoken at home and having different cultures. So he was actually the main character of that first book. It's called Dylan's Birthday Present. And the book talks about speaking different languages, and the main character has to use his knowledge of different languages to solve a problem in the book. So basically, it's portraying languages as a superpower that you have. The more languages you're able to speak, the more things you can do, the more people you can communicate with. So that was in 2019. And then now in 2024, What Makes Us Human was released, and it's my 9th children's book. So What Makes Us Human is a book that is written in the format of a riddle, where readers don't really know what the book is about until the very last page of the book. So the listeners of the podcast know that the answer is language, but most of the people who are going to be reading the book won't know that. And each one of the spreads in the book, each one of the pages will give clues as to what the topic might be. But readers are always wondering, oh, is he talking about fire? Is he talking about trees? Is he talking about something else? So both the text and the illustrations will be giving clues to the fact that it's about language, but it's very subtle clues, right? So I wanted to write What Makes Us Human basically to put a strong focus on the importance of every single language in the world. As we know, or as many of us know, there's over 7,000 languages that are currently spoken in the world. And, many people are surprised by that number. And it's like, wow, that's amazing. We have all this linguistic diversity. And indeed, it is amazing that we have all of those languages, because each one is a little window into what it means to be human, what the possibilities are of existing here, different ways of thinking, different ways of interpreting the world. But unfortunately, languages are dying at a very fast pace as well. It's estimated that every 2 weeks, a language dies, right? So just to put things in perspective, about 25% of the world's languages, 25% of those 7,000 or so languages are spoken by fewer than 1,000 people, right? So when you think of 25% are spoken by fewer than 1,000 people. So that means that, and 50% are spoken by fewer than 10,000 people. So the great majority of the languages in the world are at a very delicate point in terms of their survival, especially indigenous languages, right? Indigenous languages have a bunch of other forces that they are under the impact of. That means that they're losing speakers very fast. So, for example, indigenous populations in general, they live 20 years less than non-indigenous people. That means you have fewer speakers, you have elders that are passing away and not being able to continue to transmit the language to new generations. And when UNESCO heard of the book, they approached me and they asked if I was interested in partnering with them to get this idea of the importance of not only indigenous languages, but they're coming from the perspective of indigenous languages, because the decade of 2022 to 2032 has been chosen by the United Nations to be the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And this is a period of 10 years where, especially through the work of UNESCO, the United Nations is working with different entities, different governments to really call attention to the importance of indigenous cultures and indigenous languages. So they saw the book as a good opportunity to get it out there into the sort of general public, where it's less of an academic discussion, where it's less at the government level, but it's ordinary people like you and I who actually, we pay taxes, so we can decide, if we support language revitalization programs, etc. But just awareness, the more people are aware about the importance of language and languages and the fact that many of them are disappearing, the better it is for the cause of linguistic diversity. So the book has now been translated into 22 languages already, and almost all of them in partnership with UNESCO. So UNESCO is a co-publisher of the book.
Your deep compassion and enthusiasm and focus are clear in that wonderful description of where it has come from and what its purpose is. How indeed do you, from a heart point of view, from an experiential point of view, look at what is in the book and what you're trying to say? I noted even before you had expressed this idea that there's concepts on each page for consideration, that you were not skirting past difficulties. You were talking about, for example, in one of the 2-page spreads about that reads, when you were a baby, you hardly knew me. Over time, you have gotten to know me better and better. But when you get old, you may forget me. You also have a statement about, I can be as soft as a kitten or as harsh as the Alaskan winter. If I might even go to this last moment here with you, I can show you love, but I can also hurt you. You're looking in depth of language. Tell us about how it is that you have brought that heart to it, what your belief system is about languages, along with what you've already said about the importance of them, but your own experience.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for drawing attention to those specific pages of the book. So, just for listeners to understand my background in a nutshell, I did my undergraduate degree while I was still living in Brazil, and that was in linguistics, right? I actually focused on working with indigenous languages. And my dissertation was about a Brazilian language called Xavante, which is one of the biggest languages in Brazil. And after that, I moved to Germany and the Netherlands to do a master's degree in computational linguistics, which is basically dealing with computers and technology and how they relate to human languages. So, for example, being able to talk to your phone, Siri, automatic translation, things of that sort. And then I came to the US in 2011 to do a PhD in applied linguistics, and that's language learning. Nowadays, I work for a language testing company based in Eugene, Oregon called Avant Assessment, and we build tests in over 50 different languages. So living in these countries, Brazil, Germany, Holland, United States. I also lived in India for a little while and learned a little bit of Marathi, one of the local languages. I lived in Israel and learned a little bit of Hebrew. Came to the US, married a Ukrainian woman who is now my wife, had 2 children that from birth have spoken 3 languages. So they speak Portuguese, my native language. They speak Russian, which is my wife's native language, despite being Ukrainian. As you know, a lot of Ukrainians from the Soviet Union are very fluent or are native speakers of Russian, and they were born here. So cultures and languages have always been part of who I am, really. And I always saw them as a window into the world and something that would expand my own possibilities in the world, open doors, etc. So I think the book, What Makes Us Human, is sort of a culmination of all of these life experiences, my passion for languages. I've created materials for over 35 different languages in the past to help parents pass their languages on to their children. I've worked with UPIC, a bunch of stuff. So I think that's kind of my passion. And like you said in the book, I almost looked at the book as sort of a one-shot opportunity to bring the idea of the importance of language and languages to the general public into a single book. There are not too many chances where we can have an impact with just one work. And I think that through this, I'm having an impact that maybe I haven't had with the other things that I've done so far, right? So, for example, What Makes Us Human has already been translated into Mapudungun, which is one of the biggest or the biggest indigenous language in Chile. And the government just ordered 140,000 copies or something like that of the book for use in indigenous schools in Chile. So it's really having an impact on the ground. It's also being translated into Otomi, which is one of the indigenous languages of Mexico. And these are all editions that are being supported by the government itself, right? So it's really interesting to see that the book is having this direct impact with governments, but also with people who need those materials. So it's not just literature, at the end of the day. But the moment you translate the book into one of these languages that are, as we refer to, less commonly taught languages or endangered languages, it's directly contributing to the preservation of those languages, because you don't have those many resources in the languages to start with. And as you said, I really wanted each one of the pages in the book to be sort of a sub-theme of language. So, for example, the one you talked about, where it says, "When you were a baby, you hardly knew me. Over time, you've gotten to know me better and better. But when you are old, you may start to forget me." My intention here was to focus on language loss. And there's different ways we can look at that, right? One of which is conditions like Alzheimer's. You start getting old. Many people who have Alzheimer's, they start losing their ability to use language. They start forgetting words. They have to start paraphrasing the most basic things, right? So they might even forget the word for tears, right? When you cry, you have tears, and they might call it, let's say, eye water or something like that, right? So, but we can also talk about, for example, people who immigrated to the United States and they learned English, and when they get old and they start having some of these conditions, they revert back to their native language, the first language, and they can't communicate in English anymore because that's a more recent kind of memory, right? So that page, for example, is about that. The one about I can be as soft as a kitten or as harsh as the Alaskan winter. We are really talking about different languages, right? People perceive different languages as some languages are stronger. They have those guttural sounds that are harder to pronounce. They sound a little bit harsher. Some other languages, people talk about Italian. It's so musical. It's the language of love, You don't hear so many people saying, oh, Italian is a very harsh language. But it's also within each language, you have a more soft, caring way of communicating, and you can also communicate in a harsher way. This is intrinsic to each different language, right? And it is important that we master all of these different types of communication because they are a means to an end, depending on what it is we're doing. And, the other one you talked about, I can show you love, but also hurt you. People can't see the book right now, but we have an illustration of a tank that is sort of shooting a cannonball, and there's a city on fire, and there's a lady holding a sign that says "No War." This is a direct reference to the war in Ukraine that Russia is fighting right now against Ukraine after they invaded Ukraine, right? If you remember, there was a Russian journalist that held up, right, that sign, "No War," during live television, protesting against what Russia is doing to Ukraine. And it goes to show that what is happening there, this is one example, right? But it's not just about territory, but what they're doing is also an attack on Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture. So language permeates so many things in our lives. It's driven wars, it's driven love, it's driven so many things that we just can't get away from this beautiful thing we call language, right?
We certainly cannot. What an important integration of the material itself, talking about, and I love the way you're talking about this one shot, as it were, to be able to let people know what language is in a very accessible way. And you're also integrating it with how languages get lost, your interest in and your work with indigenous languages, and with the subtext of encouraging parents, grandparents, and communities to support children becoming multilingual, to give them that superpower and those gifts. What are some other steps that you have taken, other books that you have written, other things that you do that connect this knowledge of what language is then and its importance in humanity with the power of multilingualism and what makes people afraid for their children becoming multilingual in some in some communities, some families, some historical moments?
Yeah. So I think that everything that I've done so far, right? I've written 9 books that have been published so far, and they've been translated into over 30 different languages. And in the beginning, I self-published books, right? So What Makes Us Human, it's a publisher that came out with the book. It's, part of the publishing industry. But my initial books, when I was still learning how to write, they were all self-published. But that gave me a lot of flexibility in terms of choosing the message that I wanted to be out there, but also working with native speakers of each language that I wanted to have the book available in, to make sure that parents who were raising their children in their various languages had enough materials to use to continue to pass those languages on, right? So as I told you, me and my wife, we have always spoken to our kids in our native languages, but we live in the United States. And yes, the US is the biggest melting pot in the world. And, you probably have more diversity here than you do in any other country in terms of how many people come here, how many languages are spoken. But when you look at materials, when you look at resources for these less commonly taught languages, it is extremely hard to find. And I'm talking about languages like Russian and Portuguese, right? Which are less commonly taught, but they have tens of millions of speakers. And I found it hard to find materials that I could use with my children, books, games in those languages, so we wouldn't have to revert back to English, right? So what I did initially was take matters into my own hand and start developing games. So for example, I had a set of like flashcard games that I developed that were pretty innovative at the time, because they were the first ones that had QR codes that had the pronunciation by a native speaker. And, kids could practice writing, listening, speaking, reading in many different languages. So I ended up creating those flashcards to use with my son in Russian and in Portuguese at home. And then we had friends, because we're immigrants, foreigners. We are also connected to many other people who speak different languages. And they saw the materials and they said, "Oh, do you have that in Italian? Do you have that in Bosnian?" So there's a significant Bosnian population where I live here in Iowa. And I'm like, no, but it wouldn't be that hard to create it, because there was nothing like it around. So same thing with the books that I started writing. I just wanted to make sure that they could contribute to as many different people as possible, be available in as many different languages. So I think that's kind of my contribution, is ensuring that parents who want to pass their languages on to their children have the means to do so. So basically what I'm doing is providing the materials, but also sort of the encouragement through my books, like What Makes Us Human, but also the ones I've written before, where, language is a superpower. The more you speak, the more power you have to communicate with people, get stuff done. It's kind of trying to break a certain stigma that there is in society, that speaking a different language makes you odd, it makes you different, something you should be ashamed of, when actually it's something that we should all be jumping with joy to celebrate, right? I have never encountered ever a person at the playground. We live very close to a playground and we're always talking to our kids in different languages. I've never met a person that's like, "Oh, that's so bad that your kids speak different languages," right? And some of these people come up to us and say, I wish my kids spoke more than one language, right? So I think people understand, but it's still something that needs a little bit more fine-tuning for society at large to understand the advantages of bilingualism, right? But things are moving in a positive direction with things like, you and I know of the Seal of Biliteracy, right? Which is a state level program actually passed into law, where high school students who show they are proficient in more than one language, in all 4 skills, they get a seal on their high school diploma. And some universities around the US are actually already accepting that as college credit. So now kids not only save money, but also they save time, because they can actually study other things that will benefit them, and the language just becomes a means, right? So I think that's kind of the way I'm trying to contribute, so to speak.
You're contributing beautifully, and thank you for it. Where are we headed as a country? You see movement in direction of people, interesting there at that playground, saying, I wish my children could. As a larger society, because languages are so integrated with the concept of identity, where do you in your work see people realizing that the identity that is expressed through language can be an enhancement to others' lives rather than, if I may put it really baldly here, a threat?
I think it's one of those things that the more positive examples that they see of people who speak more than one language having advantages in their lives and being able to use those languages for positive, slowly these other people who might think differently will start to understand that maybe their view is not completely correct, right? So the way that usually there is a beautiful book called Blink, right, which is about prejudice. And the best way for you to break prejudice is by being exposed to counterexamples of that prejudice that you have. So I think that with language, it's going to be pretty similar. It's people reading books like What Makes Us Human to start opening their minds, and then they start paying more attention to what's going on around them. And they will be hard-pressed to find examples of speaking another language being detrimental to who you are, to where you can go in life, right? Sometimes we have these inaccurate views in our minds, and some people refuse to look around for counter evidence that goes against the way they think. But, sometimes that you can't really do much about those people. Some people just decide they don't want to be proven wrong, and it's hard. But I think the great majority of people, they just need to see more examples of the contrary. And I think that's where the country is kind of going, with more bilingual programs appearing, and immigrants being proud of their heritage instead of being ashamed. And I think it's a force for good. One other thing that I'd like to mention, if I may, Norah, is one thing that I've noticed with people who don't travel abroad, especially English-speaking people, right? Because being a native English speaker is a bit of a blessing and a curse. You know that, right? Because it is the language that is the most widely spoken language in the world. It's the lingua franca that unites all of the other languages, right? It's the Esperanto, so to speak, of the world. Esperanto wanted to replace English, but I don't think it really will, because it's missing that cultural baggage, that all that history that comes with the language. So I think many people who speak English as a native language and have not traveled abroad, they think that they can simply go to foreign countries and start speaking English and people will understand them. But people like us who have more experience traveling, so for example, every year I go to Bologna in Italy, because that's where they have the biggest children's book fair in the world. And this is where you have hundreds of publishers of children's books from many different countries. And the whole fair is based on negotiation of foreign rights. So somebody writes a book, the publisher is there trying to sell rights to the book. So let's say it's an Italian publisher. They want to sell rights to the book to a Japanese publisher who will then translate the book into Japanese, publish it in Japan. And even in Bologna, you find so many people who do not speak English, right? And you would think that this is a prime location where everybody would be conversant in English, but it's not. So I think there's also this perception from many people, going back to your question, right? Where's the nation kind of headed? I think that this is one thing that people have to understand, that just speaking English, for example, it's not a guarantee that you can go anywhere and be able to communicate. You're going to hit many obstacles in many different countries where you're going to find a large number of people that will not be able to understand you if you don't speak the local language, right? And even if you can communicate with them in your own language, I'm using English as an example, but it could be another major language out there. Even if you can communicate with them in your own native language, not having to learn theirs, you're not going to be able to open all of those doors. You're not going to have full access to who they are, to the culture of the country. Unless you learn the language, the ceiling is limited, so to speak, in your experience.
Thank you for that clarity. It is an encouragement. You are correct that in our exposure, you and I here as conversationalists today, that our experiences of traveling in, living in, being a part of cultures that are outside of the mainland U.S. By background, have a way of knowing the variety, the welcome, the safety that comes from being engaged in other cultures and other languages. There's not a threat there, and that mood is part of what this book provides too, and everything that you're saying. So thank you for that. I would like to say here, I would love to hear a story about young Victor Santos, how it became evident to you that you were excited about languages and studying languages and doing linguistic things. How did that come about? Tell a story about your young life.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for asking. And I think you're right in that with most of us, right, the experiences we have pretty young, they kind of define or they direct where we're going to go and who we're going to be in the future. So I was born in Brazil and I started learning English at the age of 10. My mom put me in a private English school. Back when I was growing up, unfortunately, in terms of public education and just having English classes or foreign language classes in school, it wasn't the greatest quality. So you had to go to a private school in order to get better. So it was 10. I was 10 when I started learning English. And, from 10 until 17, I believe, I was taking like 3 different courses at the same time at different levels just because I loved being able to watch Friends, things that I wouldn't be able to understand in my local language because it's translated and you lose the meaning, etc. But I remember very clearly when it was time to go to college, right? At the time, you actually had to already know what you wanted to study before you took the test. So it was not like in the US where you have the SAT, this general test that everybody can take. And then after, depending on your scores, you can go to med school, you can do whatever. In Brazil at the time, I already had to know what I would like to be. Let's say I wanted to be a lawyer, and I would take the university test just for law school. If you wanted to be something else, you had to take a test just for that. And at the time, I didn't really know what I wanted to be. Everybody was saying like, oh, you should do something with publicity because you're extroverted and, you like communicating, etc. But I'm like, yeah, just because you might be somewhat good at something, it doesn't mean it's your passion, right? So my mom sat me down and she said, what do you like in this life? And I said, I like languages. And she said, well, so here's what you're going to do. You're going to keep studying English and you're going to have such a good command of this specific language that no matter what you decide to do, no matter what your profession is going to be down the line, it's going to be useful for you. So it's okay. You don't have to go to college at 17. I actually went to college when I was 21. And from 17 to 21, I was basically studying English the whole time so that I had that tool in my arsenal, right? And also, we were part of the Rotary Club. You've heard of the Rotary Club? And I think that by the time I was 18, we probably had maybe over 12 exchange students live with us. So we had, most of them came from the US. So I had the opportunity to use the language, use English with them. But we had people from India, people from Japan. And that gave me that early access to different cultures, using language to communicate with different people. Right. And I had this one cousin that was a doctor, always traveling to a different country. And one of the highlights of my week was talking to him after he came back from a trip. And I'm like, tell me, what did you see? Where did you go? What did you learn? Right. So I think that that's kind of the seed of my passion for languages in different cultures, and all the rest came from that positive experience I had growing up.
And you see, there is that refreshing item again, that we do not have to be learning languages in order to make sure that we don't become ill, although languages help with that, or so that we can get the very best job ever, although languages help with that. But because languages fix problems, bring joy, connect with people, we can have fun.
It doesn't always have to be a utilitarian approach, right? I'm going to learn a language because I want to achieve this. I want to make more money, or I want to move somewhere else. Just learning a language is such a fun brain exercise. And yes, there's health benefits and everything, right? But one thing that I don't hear people talk much when we talk about language learning is that it's this is something that I've experienced, and I would bet that you've been there as well. You were telling me about your background, your heritage background with Croatian, right? When you speak a different language, you understand yourself in a different way. It's almost like having another personality, right? It's kind of hard to express, but the way I communicate in English or in French, for example, is different from the way I communicate in Portuguese. There are certain languages that I feel more confident in. So, for example, I feel more confident in English than I do in Portuguese. But if I'm talking about things that are very close to my heart, I'm going to go back to my native language, right? So there's not necessarily a utilitarian view to this, right? Speaking different languages because you want to achieve something of financial benefit or something else. But it's an opportunity for you to get to know yourself better. When you express yourself in different languages, it's very interesting. It's kind of tapping into a different side of yourself.
It does indeed. I concur. And of course, we've read anecdotal reports and others of people that have experienced that, where our language X is touching our heart deeply, as you say. And I know that in my case, that the Croatian that is in my mind, in my memory, and speaking with the family was related to a very, very traditional way of life that much of which has disappeared. And I sort of feel like the guardian of it through the language and those cultural experiences that came through the language. How beautifully said. Where is Victor Santos headed next with regard to what you want to tell the world about languages, or what you want to do in the case with Indigenous? What's your next project?
I think I definitely see myself in this common path of trying to make materials that I produce available in as many languages as possible. I think that this is sort of the contribution that I am able to make through my books, continue to ensure they're translated into as many languages as possible, and making sure that people who speak other languages have as many materials available as possible if they decide to pass those languages on to their children, right? Because what makes a language die? What causes language death? I mean, there's the extreme case of decimation, right? You might have an indigenous tribe that might have 10 speakers, and, everybody is unfortunately killed, and boom, that's the end of the language right there. But the usual case for the majority of languages die when parents decide to no longer pass those languages to their children. And very quickly, in one generation, the language can lose a very large number of speakers. So right now in the US, for example, of the 175 indigenous languages that we have, only 3 have more than 10,000 speakers. I'm going to pause here because I want to ask listeners if they know what those 3 languages are. So Navajo, which was extremely important for the US from a national security standpoint as well during World War II. It was one of the secret codes used by the US during the war that allowed for a very specific battle to be won that made a big difference to the war. Yupik, spoken in Alaska. You had Brendan Locke, for example, as one of your guests, talking about the beautiful things he's doing with Yupik and other languages in the Anchorage School District in Alaska. And we have Apache, which is another indigenous language. Only 3 have more than 10,000 speakers. And when you talk about indigenous materials, you see a lot of books written by indigenous people, and you go to the website and you're like, okay, so let's get all these books in indigenous languages. But the great majority are books written in English by indigenous creators. They might be talking about, creation myths. They might be talking about native stories, but it's all in English. It's not in the native language. So it's very hard for you as a parent, as an educator, to want to ask children to learn or preserve their heritage language when you don't have materials. They look around, they don't see representation in the books in terms of the characters because all the characters look white. They don't look indigenous. The books are not written in an indigenous language. So we can't really blame these kids for thinking that speaking that language is not going to be a very useful tool for them. We have to change things by making sure there are more materials available out there. Kids want to read Harry Potter. They want to read Dogman. They want to have fun. It's not just because they might come from a different culture that they want to do things that are so different from the way kids in the other majority culture or language are doing. Kids are kids. Kids want to be entertained by beautiful stories. They want to have fun. But if you don't have those books translated in their languages, the only thing they can do is use English. As a parent of trilingual kids, I can tell you from experience that getting a book written in another language, right? So for example, me here in the United States with my kids, getting a book written in English and trying to translate during bedtime on the fly into a Portuguese is a very hard experience. No matter how proficient you are, you're gonna make mistakes. It's gonna be cumbersome, and kids will notice that, and they're gonna start thinking, it's not as much fun when we read books in Portuguese. Dad talks more slowly, etc. So you need to have those materials in the native languages, right? So I think that's kind of where my path is going to continue. Creating stories that touch people and that are translated into as many different languages as possible. They may not be stories about language per se. My last book is about Alzheimer's. The whole book is about Alzheimer's, right? It has nothing to do with language, but it has already been translated into Korean and Chinese. So I think that no matter what I do, I'll continue writing books because I believe in the power of books to touch children and change the minds of adults as well. I very much believe in that precious, sacred time of reading books with children and all the lessons and love that can be exchanged there. It's easier to change minds when you are lying in bed with a book.
That's fantastic, and we will look forward to following you on that path and seeing what you do. Victor, before we leave this conversation today, please think of what you would like to re-emphasize to my listeners, or say something that I did not ask you about and you want to make sure that it's heard. You want to exhort or invite, whatever it is that comes to your heart and mind now that you want to make sure the listeners have from you.
What makes us human, for example, one of the people that endorsed the book, so to speak, was Yalitza Aparicio. She was nominated for an Oscar for Best Actress in 2019 with a movie called Roma. And when I saw her reading the book, it was something that it just made me aware of the impact that is happening, right? It's so nice to be able to do something that is fulfilling. And I don't usually cry, but I cried that day just to know that what you're doing is having an impact. And something from my heart that I'd like to share with readers is just appreciate language diversity, appreciate diversity in general, because it's something that we all need. The world is becoming more monocultural to some extent. And, there's a declaration on cultural diversity from UNESCO, actually, from 2001, that says that cultural diversity is as important to humankind as biological diversity is. And languages are an integral part of cultural diversity. When a language dies, a whole culture can die with it as well. And that's one thing that the book reinforces. So I think from my heart, it's just to ask people to think of the value of languages, be respectful when they meet somebody who speaks a different language, be curious about it. Ask them where they come from. What language is it? Everybody likes talking about themselves, feeling special. And just have an open mind.
A healthy ecosystem has diversity within it to help to balance and to provide for a variety of needs for a variety of living beings. And that certainly seems very much analogous to what happens with linguistic and cultural diversity. Victor, this has been a great pleasure. Per your comment, we could go on for 4 hours, plumbing the insights that you have and the experiences that you've provided and will continue to do so. Has been just deeply moving and informative and especially inspiring. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure, Norah. And thank you so much for your podcast. I love what you're doing. I love your guests, and I think we're all better off for it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victor. Take care. Thank you for listening to this conversation with my guest, Victor Santos. Check out my website, fluency.consulting, for more information about Victor and his work, and to order a copy of What Makes Us Human for yourself and/or your public library. And until next time, be thinking, how have you observed that language indeed makes us human?